For decades, South Korea was presented as one of the greatest economic success stories in modern history, a country that transformed itself from poverty into a global powerhouse within just a few generations. Seoul became a futuristic megacity filled with giant tech companies, luxury apartments, high-speed internet, and some of the most competitive schools on earth. To outsiders, South Korea looked modern, wealthy, and highly successful. But according to several former recruiters and hiring managers, there's another reality hiding beneath the polished image, one that many young Koreans no longer believe will improve. A growing number of people in their 20s and 30s are reportedly giving up on the traditional goals their parents once considered normal. Marriage rates are collapsing. Birth rates have fallen to some of the lowest levels ever recorded globally. Buying a home in Seoul feels impossible for many workers. And, according to some recruiters, large numbers of young employees now approach work with exhaustion instead of ambition. One former recruiter described interviewing candidates who no longer talked about building a future, only about surviving the present. During the economic boom years of the 1990s and 2000s, many Koreans believed hard work and education would eventually guarantee stability and success. But after years of rising housing prices, brutal competition, long working hours, expensive education costs, and economic pressure, many young people now feel trapped inside a system they no longer believe rewards them fairly. And according to some former insiders, that quiet loss of hope may be becoming one of South Korea's biggest long-term problems. After the devastation of the Korean War, South Korea experienced one of the fastest economic transformations in modern history. During the second half of the 20th century, the country rapidly industrialized and built powerful global corporations like Samsung, Hyundai Motor Company, and LG Corporation. Cities expanded quickly, technology advanced rapidly, millions of families escaped poverty within just a few decades. To many people around the world, South Korea became proof that relentless hard work and education could transform an entire nation. But beneath that success story, an extremely competitive social system quietly developed. From an early age, Korean students entered one of the most intense education systems in the world. Academic performance became deeply connected to future career opportunities, financial stability, and social status. Many students spent long hours inside schools, followed by private academies known as hagwons, where they continued studying late into the night, preparing for exams. Entry into elite universities became one of the most important goals for many families because top schools were often seen as gateways to stable corporate careers and long-term success. During the economic boom years of the 1990s and 2000s, this system appeared to work. Many young Koreans believed that if they studied hard enough and secured jobs at major corporations, they could eventually achieve middle-class stability, buying an apartment, getting married, raising children, and improving their lives compared to previous generations. But over time, the pressure inside the system intensified dramatically. Competition for university admission became more brutal. Entry-level hiring at major companies became increasingly difficult. Housing prices in cities like Seoul surged to levels many younger workers could no longer realistically afford. Secure long-term employment became less guaranteed than before. According to several former recruiters, expectations placed on young Koreans continued rising while economic stability became far more uncertain. Some candidates reportedly entered the workforce already emotionally exhausted after years of non-stop academic pressure. Another major issue involves South Korea's corporate work culture. The country became internationally known for long working hours, hierarchical office environments, and intense workplace pressure. Many employees felt expected to prioritize work over personal life, relationships, or mental health. While older generations often accepted these sacrifices as necessary for economic growth, many younger Koreans gradually began questioning whether the rewards still justified the pressure. According to some former recruiters, younger workers increasingly stopped believing that hard work alone would guarantee a stable future. The traditional life path elite university, stable corporate job, marriage, home ownership, and children started feeling financially unrealistic for growing numbers of people. And once confidence in that system weakened, frustration quietly began spreading across an entire generation. According to several former recruiters, one of the biggest changes inside South Korea over the last decade has been the growing feeling among young people that no matter how hard they work, they are falling behind anyway. During the economic boom years of the 1990s and early 2000s, many Koreans still believed the system rewarded effort. Good grades could lead to a stable corporate job. Stable employment could eventually lead to marriage, home ownership, and family life. But for many people now in their 20s and 30s, that path increasingly feels financially impossible. One of the biggest reasons is housing. Apartment prices in Seoul and surrounding areas surged dramatically over the past decade. In some neighborhoods, prices climbed far faster than salaries, making home ownership feel unreachable for many younger workers even after years of saving. Former recruiters say many candidates entering the workforce already assume they may never be able to afford property in Seoul at all. This creates a major psychological shift because home ownership was once considered one of the core symbols of stability and adulthood in South Korean society. Another growing pressure comes from employment itself. Competition for stable jobs at major corporations remains extremely intense. Thousands of highly educated applicants often compete for limited openings at companies like Samsung or Hyundai Motor Company. Many young workers spend years preparing resumes, certifications, language exams, and interview training simply to compete for entry-level positions. According to some recruiters, candidates increasingly appear exhausted before their careers even properly begin. Another hidden issue involves inequality between generations. Older generations who benefited from South Korea's earlier economic boom often accumulated wealth through rising property values and long-term corporate stability. But younger workers entered adulthood during a much more expensive and competitive environment. Many now feel they are working harder while receiving less stability in return. Some former recruiters claim this has created growing cynicism among younger Koreans toward traditional ideas about success. Another major factor is burnout. South Korea's work culture remains notoriously demanding in many industries. Long working hours, pressure to conform socially within companies, and fear of career failure create enormous mental strain. Some young employees increasingly prioritize personal survival over long-term ambition simply because they feel emotionally exhausted. This exhaustion has started influencing major life decisions. Increasing numbers of young Koreans are delaying or rejecting marriage entirely. Others openly say they do not want children because of financial pressure, housing costs, work stress, and uncertainty about the future. South Korea's birth rate eventually fell to one of the lowest ever recorded globally, a statistic that shocked economists and policymakers around the world. According to several former recruiters, this is not simply about young people losing interest in family life. Many insiders believe it reflects something deeper, a generation quietly losing confidence that the system around them can still provide a stable future worth investing their lives into. In recent years, a phrase has become increasingly common inside South Korea, the idea of a give-up generation. According to several former recruiters and hiring managers, more young Koreans are quietly abandoning goals that previous generations once considered basic parts of adult life: marriage, home ownership, raising children, long-term career loyalty. For many people in their 20s and 30s, these goals no longer feel realistic. They feel financially and emotionally overwhelming. Some former recruiters describe interviewing candidates who no longer talk about building a future at all. Instead, many focus almost entirely on short-term survival, keeping stable employment, paying rent, managing debt, and avoiding burnout. According to some insiders, this psychological shift may be one of the biggest social changes happening inside South Korea today. One major reason is the extreme cost of modern life in cities like Seoul. Housing prices remain extraordinarily high relative to salaries for many younger workers. Education costs are also extremely expensive, especially for families who feel pressure to place children into private academies and elite educational tracks. Raising a child in South Korea is increasingly viewed by many young adults as financially risky rather than emotionally achievable. Another major issue involves work culture. South Korea became globally famous for rapid economic growth, but that growth was built partly on extremely demanding workplace expectations. Long office hours, strict corporate hierarchies, social pressure from managers, and intense competition remain common in many industries. While older generations often accepted these sacrifices as necessary for national success, many younger Koreans increasingly question whether the rewards still justify the pressure. According to some recruiters, younger workers now prioritize emotional survival more than career ambition because many no longer believe corporate loyalty guarantees long-term stability. Some young employees reportedly describe themselves as permanently exhausted. Another hidden problem is social comparison. South Korea's highly connected digital culture constantly exposes young people to images of wealth, luxury apartments, beauty standards, expensive lifestyles, and career success. Social pressure to appear successful remains extremely intense. But according to several former recruiters, many young workers privately feel they are failing to keep up financially, no matter how hard they work. This creates a dangerous emotional cycle. Competition increases, stress increases, but confidence in the future continues declining. Some analysts now believe South Korea's collapsing birth rate reflects much more than simple demographic change. It may represent a deeper loss of trust in the future itself. Increasing numbers of young people openly state they do not believe marriage, parenthood, or home ownership are achievable without extreme financial sacrifice. Others fear bringing children into a society they themselves no longer feel secure inside. Former recruiters also claim another shift is happening quietly in the workplace: emotional detachment. Some younger workers no longer view jobs as long-term identities or sources of pride. Instead, work increasingly becomes something to endure temporarily while trying to preserve mental health and financial survival. That mentality would have been almost unthinkable during South Korea's earlier economic boom decades, when corporate success and national growth were deeply connected to personal identity. But according to several insiders, many younger Koreans now feel disconnected from the promises that once powered the country's rise. And as that disconnect grows, South Korea may be facing more than just an economic problem. It may be confronting a quiet crisis of hope, spreading through an entire generation. According to several former recruiters, one of the most disturbing changes inside South Korea is not simply economic pressure, it's emotional exhaustion. Many hiring managers say younger applicants today often appear far more drained, anxious, and discouraged than candidates from previous generations. Some recruiters describe interviewing highly educated applicants in their 20s who already seem emotionally burned out before even beginning full-time careers. Others say many candidates no longer speak confidently about long-term goals, promotions, marriage, or financial success. Instead, conversations increasingly revolve around stability, survival, and avoiding complete exhaustion. One former recruiter described meeting candidates who openly admitted they no longer expected life to become easier, no matter how hard they worked. During the economic boom years of the 1990s and 2000s, many young Koreans still believed sacrifice would eventually lead to upward mobility. Long study hours, difficult entrance exams, and intense competition were accepted because people believed the system still rewarded effort. But according to some recruiters, that belief has weakened significantly over the past decade. Another major issue is workplace culture itself. South Korea's corporate environment remains heavily hierarchical in many industries. Younger employees often face pressure not only to perform well professionally, but also to conform socially inside the workplace. Long office hours, after-work gatherings, and fear of disappointing senior management can create enormous psychological strain. Some younger workers increasingly feel trapped between older corporate expectations and modern economic realities that no longer provide the same rewards previous generations received. Several recruiters also point to another growing problem: uncertainty. Even highly educated young workers increasingly worry about job security, housing costs, and long-term financial survival. Contract work, unstable employment, and and rising living expenses create constant pressure that many candidates carry into interviews and workplaces. According to some insiders, many younger employees now approach careers defensively rather than optimistically. Another psychological shift involves ambition itself. Former recruiters claim some younger workers no longer dream about becoming executives, buying luxury apartments, or climbing corporate hierarchies the way earlier generations often did. Instead, many prioritize personal time, emotional stability, and avoiding burnout. To older generations, this sometimes appears like laziness or lack of ambition. But according to some recruiters, it may actually reflect a generation that no longer believes extreme sacrifice guarantees meaningful rewards. And as more young Koreans quietly, emotionally disconnect from the system around them, recruiters say the country may be facing a deeper problem than labor shortages or declining birth rates, a growing number of young people who simply no longer trust the future they were told to work toward. Today, one of the biggest fears facing South Korea is not simply economic slowdown, it's the possibility that an entire generation is quietly losing faith in the future itself. South Korea still remains one of the most technologically advanced and economically powerful countries in Asia. Companies like Samsung and Hyundai Motor Company continue dominating global industries. Seoul remains one of the world's most modern cities, but according to several former recruiters, the deeper problem is psychological. More young Koreans no longer believe the traditional path of hard work and sacrifice guarantees stability the way it once did. This loss of confidence is already producing visible consequences. South Korea's birth rate fell to some of the lowest levels ever recorded globally. Marriage rates continue declining. Increasing numbers of young adults delay or avoid home ownership entirely because housing prices feel unreachable. Some younger workers are also prioritizing emotional survival over long-term corporate ambition after years of intense academic and workplace pressure. Another hidden issue is demographic decline. As fewer children are born and the population ages, South Korea could eventually face growing labor shortages, rising pension pressure, and slower economic growth over the coming decades. Governments have already spent billions of dollars attempting to encourage marriage and childbirth, but according to many insiders, financial incentives alone may not solve the deeper emotional and economic frustration many young people feel. Some analysts believe South Korea may now be confronting a difficult contradiction created by its own success. The country built one of the most competitive societies in the world in order to achieve extraordinary economic growth. But over time, that same pressure may have become emotionally unsustainable for many younger people living inside the system. And according to several former recruiters, if growing numbers of young Koreans continue emotionally disconnecting from traditional life goals, the country may eventually face a crisis far larger than economics alone, a slow collapse in collective belief that the future will actually become better than the present. From the outside, South Korea still looks like one of the most successful countries in the world. The technology is advanced, the cities are modern. Companies like Samsung and Hyundai Motor Company continue shaping global industries, and places like Seoul still appear futuristic and full of opportunity. But, according to several former recruiters, a quieter crisis may be growing underneath the surface, one built not only on economic pressure, but on emotional exhaustion and fading hope. More young Koreans are reportedly giving up on goals that previous generations once considered normal: marriage, children, home ownership, and lifelong corporate careers. Not because they necessarily reject those dreams, but because many no longer believe those dreams are realistically attainable anymore. The lights of South Korea's success story are still bright, but according to some insiders, the generation expected to carry the country's future forward increasingly feels disconnected from the system around them. And if enough young people stop believing sacrifice will eventually lead to stability, South Korea may eventually face a challenge far deeper than economics alone, a society where growing numbers of people quietly stop believing the future will reward them at all.